Welcome to another deep dive. We're going deep into the world of true crime today. Yeah, a world where the lines between quote unquote normal and, well, monster are very blurred. You want to know more about Daniel Conahan, right? And the Hog Trail murders that have haunted Southwest Florida for decades.
Yeah, for sure. We're diving into a case that's super complex and really disturbing.
Yeah.
We're going to start with Conahan's Wikipedia page. But we're also looking at a lot of other articles and reports, trying to piece together this puzzle.
Yeah, it's a puzzle for sure. So, for people who maybe aren't familiar with the case, who exactly is Daniel Conahan,
Right.
and what makes his story so, well, so terrifying?
So Daniel Conahan is a convicted murderer. He's currently on death row in Florida. He was convicted for killing Richard Montgomery. Montgomery was one of the victims they found along what locals call the Hog Trail. It's basically a bunch of isolated, wooded areas where they found several bodies in the 1990s. But the police think Montgomery was just one of many victims.
And that's where it gets really crazy, right? I mean, the details of the murders, the locations, the victims, it all points to a specific and, yeah, really disturbing way these crimes were done.
Exactly. And probably the most unsettling thing is how some of the victims were found. Take William Melaragno. His body was posed in the shape of a cross, almost like some kind of ritual. It makes you wonder, what was the killer trying to say? Was it some weird, twisted performance?
Trying to picture that, finding a body posed like that, it must have been just awful for the investigators, like something right out of a horror movie.
Oh, for sure. It's creepy just thinking about it. And that's what makes this case so fascinating and also so scary. It's a level of cruelty that's hard to even understand.
So, okay, let's go back to the beginning. Who was Daniel Conahan before he became the suspected Hog Trail Killer? Is there anything in his past that might, I don't know, give us clues about how this all happened?
Well, if you just look at the surface, his early life seemed pretty normal. He was born in 1954, grew up in a typical family, moved to Punta Gorda, Florida, not long after he was born. But if you look closer, things get a little more complicated. Conahan himself talked about how hard it was being a young man and coming to terms with his sexuality, especially back then in the 1970s. It was a different time, right?
Yeah.
Society wasn't as accepting of homosexuality back then.
Yeah, his Wikipedia page even says that his parents didn't really accept it and they made him go to psychiatric treatments. Can you imagine how hard that must have been for him?
It was a tough time to be different. A lot of LGBTQ plus people were pressured to change who they were. There was conversion therapy and all sorts of, honestly, pretty harmful stuff.
Yeah.
It's not hard to see how being rejected like that could mess someone up.
That's a good point, thinking about the context of this case. We can't just look at Conahan's story without thinking about all the pressures and prejudices back then.
Totally agree. It's super important to think about the bigger picture, the social and cultural stuff, when you're looking at any true crime case. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps us understand maybe why he did it.
Okay, so he struggles with his sexuality, his parents reject him, and then he joins the Navy in 1977. But he's dishonorably discharged just a year later.
Exactly. He had some problems in the Navy, what they called inappropriate behavior, even tried to sexually assault another officer. That seems to be what got him kicked out.
But wouldn't a licensed practical nurse have to go through background checks? How could someone who was dishonorably discharged for something so serious end up caring for patients?
Yeah, that's a good question. It makes you wonder if there were some problems back then that let him slip through. Maybe the background checks weren't as good, or maybe people weren't sharing information the way they should. It's scary to think about, knowing what we know now.
For sure. So, after the Navy, he moved around for a bit before ending up back in Punta Gorda in 1993. He lived with his parents and, get this, he actually becomes a licensed practical nurse. Even graduated at the top of his class in 1995. I mean, it's like a Jekyll and Hyde thing, right? On the surface, he's caring for people, but underneath, there's this darkness growing.
Exactly. That's what makes Conahan such a mystery.
Mm.
How can someone who takes care of people also be capable of such awful things? It's something that investigators and psychologists still can't figure out.
Yeah, it's like this really unsettling thought. A guy living what seems like a totally normal life, working as a nurse, but then at the same time, he's out there doing these horrible things. So that takes us to the Hog Trail murders. What can you tell me about that first victim they found, and how did that, kick off this whole investigation?
Well, the first body turned up in 1994. It was just outside of Port Charlotte. Pretty gruesome scene. The body was mutilated, missing genitalia. And get this, they didn't actually identify the victim until 2021. It was Gerald Lombard. He had disappeared back in 1991. They used DNA technology, something they didn't have back then.
DNA analysis has been a game changer for these cold cases. Can you explain a little bit about how that works, like how it helps them figure out who the victims are after all this time?
Oh, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Basically, they compare the DNA they find at the crime scene or, on the body with DNA samples from people who might be a match, like family members of missing people. It's like a super complicated puzzle. Each piece of DNA is like a clue. And with these big DNA databases now and better ways to get DNA from old samples, they're solving cases that people thought were impossible.
That's so cool. It's like they're giving these victims their voices back, giving their families some answers after all these years.
Yeah, totally. It's about bringing closure, even if it's a little bittersweet.
Oh, right. So in 1994, they find that first victim, but sadly, it was just the beginning. More bodies showed up along the Hog Trail over the next few years, and the investigation into the Hog Trail murders really starts to heat up. Were there any cases that were, like, especially creepy or strange to you?
Oh, yeah. There were a few that were just brutal. The way they found the bodies was terrifying. Like in 1996, they found some skeletal remains in Sarasota County. And the way they found them, it's really disturbing. Imagine this. A family's dog brings home a human skull.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the rest of the bones were nearby. Signs of really bad mutilation.
Uh, just awful. Can you imagine those families trying to understand what happened, dealing with that kind of horror? It just shows how much these crimes affect everyone, not just the victim.
Yeah, absolutely. The impact goes way beyond the actual loss of life. You've got families who are destroyed, questions that never get answered, and a fear that just hangs around even after the case is closed.
It's true. And all the while, investigators are trying to put the pieces together, looking for a pattern, a motive, anything to help them find whoever is doing this. Was there any specific discovery that led them to Conahan?
Yeah, there was. This is in 1996. They found Kenneth Smith and Richard Montgomery. That was a big turning point. You see, Montgomery's mom had told the police that her son had become friends with this guy named Dan Conahan before he disappeared. And then they found some stuff at Conahan's place, like credit card records, that linked him to Montgomery. And to another important person in this case, Stanley Burden.
Okay, wait. Who's Stanley Burden? I keep hearing his name, but we haven't really talked about him yet.
Stanley Burden's crucial to this whole thing. He's the one who got away. Conahan tied him to a tree and almost strangled him, but Burden escaped. His testimony was the key to getting Conahan convicted for killing Montgomery.
Wow, that's incredible. So he survived this terrifying attack and then had the courage to testify against Conahan. That's some serious bravery.
Yeah, no kidding.
Oh.
And what he said was super important. He gave a first-hand account of how Conahan operated. It gave everyone a glimpse into how messed up this guy really was.
It's just crazy. Okay, so Conahan is in prison for killing Montgomery, but you said earlier that the police think there are a lot more victims. What makes them think that? What else have they found since they arrested him?
So, in 1997, someone found a skeleton under a pepper tree in Port Charlotte. Turns out it was William Patton. He vanished back in 1993. This is a big deal because it meant that Conahan might have started killing even earlier than they thought. And then, hold on to your hat, in 2007, they made another crazy discovery in Southwest Florida. They found 8 skulls and a bunch of other skeletal remains in Fort Myers. It was the biggest discovery of its kind in Florida's history. And guess what? This place was less than a mile from where they attacked Stanley Burden.
Wait a minute, are you saying that the Fort Myers 8, is that what they call them, might be connected to Conahan?
Well, the location is suspicious. Plus, a lot of the victims fit the profile of Conahan's other victims, like people who were kind of transient, living on the edge of society. So yeah, investigators think there's a good chance he was involved.
Man, that's a scary thought. To think that Conahan might be responsible for so many more deaths, it's a lot to process for the families and the investigators who are still trying to figure this all out. But let's talk about the Fort Myers 8 for a second. What do we actually know about them? Have they been able to identify any of them?
Yeah, they have. They've identified 4 of the 8 victims using DNA and other investigative techniques. Their names are John Blevins, Eric Kohler, Jonathan Tyhe, and Robert Soden. They all disappeared between 1995 and 1996.
So 4 identified, but 4 are still unknown. Are they doing anything to try and figure out who those other 4 are?
They are. They've released facial reconstructions of the 4 unidentified victims. You can actually find them online. It's pretty cool. They use forensic science and art to create a picture of what the person looked like just from their skull.
Whoa, that's really interesting. How does that even work? And what kind of impact does that have on these cold cases? I bet it's got to be emotional for the families to see a face after all this time.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing process. These forensic artists, they use the skull as a base, and then they build up the muscles, tissue, and skin, all based on like anatomy and population averages. It can
Yeah.
be incredibly accurate.
Yeah.
And yeah, the impact is huge. It's not just about identifying someone. It's about showing that they were a real person,
Yeah.
giving them back their face. For families, it can be a way to finally get some peace after years of not knowing.
And in this day and age, with the internet and everything, those pictures could reach millions of people. Someone might recognize one of those faces and give the investigators the missing piece they need to solve the case.
You got it. It's a great example of how technology and collaboration can help solve crimes, even ones that have been cold for a long time.
It really is amazing how something as simple as like an image online could solve a case. It's like proof that we're all connected somehow, right? And that even the smallest things can make a difference. But I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the psychology behind all of this. We've talked about the victims, the places where it happened, those awful discoveries. But what about Conahan himself? What kind of person does these things?
That's the million-dollar question with serial killers, isn't it? What makes someone kill another person? Not just once, but over and over. And the cruelty, the planning. There's no easy answer. And it's not fair to say that all people like this are the same, just because a few of them do these terrible things. But if we look at Conahan's life, well, there are some things that pop up that might give us some clues.
Oh, okay.
Like what? Well, for starters, his relationship with his own sexuality. The way his parents reacted, the psychiatric treatments, being kicked out of the Navy for, that sexual assault attempt. It all points to some serious inner turmoil. Maybe a struggle with accepting himself. Maybe even some anger and resentment towards society because they didn't accept him.
Makes sense. Some people might say he was taking it out on his own community, like he had all this internalized homophobia and he projected it onto his victims.
It's definitely a theory. It's possible. Maybe his own issues with identity and acceptance came out in this really messed up way. And then you've got the whole control thing, the way he overpowered his victims, tied them up, mutilated them. It seems like he needed to be in control, to have power over other people, maybe because he felt powerless in his own life.
So it's like he made this world where he was the one in charge, and it's scary, just awful. So, okay, Conahan's in prison, right? Serving a life sentence for killing Montgomery. But knowing that there are maybe, like, tons of other victims out there, what's happening with the investigation now? Are they still actively trying to find out more, or is it pretty much a closed case?
Oh, no, it's definitely not over just because Conahan's behind bars. The investigation is still going. Even though it's hard, it's kind of a race against time.
Yeah.
Every year that passes, memories get fuzzy, evidence disappears, and it gets harder and harder to find answers.
But like we were saying before, technology is always changing, getting better. Maybe there are new forensic tools, new ways to look at the evidence that could break the case open.
Yeah, that's what keeps the investigators going. They're not giving up, always looking for new ways to approach this case.
It's inspiring, really, their dedication. It gives the families hope. It's like a reminder that even when things seem really hopeless, there's always a chance for justice.
Couldn't agree more. It's something we all need to remember, not just for this case, but for life in general.
This whole deep dive has been intense, to be honest. We went through some gruesome details, talked about the psychology, and there's still so many unanswered questions. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
I'm listening.
We talked about the victims, possible motives, the evidence. But what about the people who got away? The ones who met Conahan but survived? What can we learn from their experiences?
Yeah, you're right. Those stories are important too. The stories of resilience, of escaping something so awful. Those are the stories that remind us that there's always hope, even in the darkest times.
And maybe if we understand those stories, listen to what those survivors have to say, we can figure out how to protect ourselves better, like how to see the warning signs, how to help others who might be in danger.
That's a great point. So to everyone listening, I challenge you to find those stories of survival, learn from them, tell other people about them. Let's all do our part to make sure the darkness doesn't win.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we come to the end of our deep dive into the case of Daniel Conahan and the Hog Trail murders. We covered a lot today, folks. I hope it's given you some insights, made you think, and maybe even left you feeling a little more empowered. Remember, knowledge is power. By understanding these crimes, the warning signs, and the minds of the people who commit them, we can all stay safer. Keep asking questions, stay informed, and until next time, stay safe out there.